Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive. Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into some truly thought-provoking material. We've been handed a document, and it's described by its author as, well, a systematic and empirical compilation of observable behaviors. The title alone gives you a hint of its provocative nature. You know you're in a woke cult if it's certainly designed to grab attention.
And what's particularly noteworthy right from the start is the explicit methodology outlined in the introduction. The source clearly states it focused on observable behaviors within leftist circles, and it established a specific threshold for including a trait on this list.
Right.
A behavior was noted if one individual exhibited a particular behavior 3 times, or if 3 separate individuals each demonstrated the same behavior at least once, culminating in a total of 3 instances.
3 times, okay.
Yeah. This approach is presented as a quantitative analysis of social behaviors, aiming to highlight patterns of ideological commitments and, as the source puts it, how certain ideas take root and flourish within leftist discourse. It suggests a deliberate, almost like clinical observation of specific actions.
Exactly. Our mission today is not to endorse or refute the claims made in this document. Not at all. Instead, we're here to explore the specific traits identified, to try and understand the perspective they're coming from, and maybe consider what this document might mean for how certain ideas gain traction and manifest in everyday life. We'll be impartial guides, helping you, our listener, navigate this challenging and often, well, contentious material. So, as we embark on this analysis, what strikes you, conceptually, about this whole idea of dissecting behaviors to imply something as strong as ideological conformity or even a cult?
Well, it immediately prompts us to consider the underlying framework, doesn't it? The source isn't just presenting, like, a collection of observations. It's presenting them as evidence of a specific kind of group dynamic. The provocative title, of course, sets the stage, but the stated methodology attempts to ground it in observation. It wants to seem empirical.
Right. To kick us off, let's really drill into the source's foundational premise, because it's crucial for understanding the entire document, I think. It describes this list as a reflection of how certain ideas take root and flourish within leftist discourse, serving both as an analytical tool for understanding contemporary social dynamics and as a commentary on the ways in which ideological conformity can manifest in everyday life.
So not just anecdotes.
Exactly. It's explicitly presented as a measured, almost scientific observation of specific social patterns. That's the claim, anyway.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source is fundamentally suggesting that these aren't just isolated random actions or, individual quirks. Instead, it posits them as patterns indicative of broader ideological commitments, where individuals reinforce each other's beliefs and actions, effectively constructing a cultural framework that perpetuates specific narratives and values.
A cultural framework.
Yeah. This raises an important question, really. How do communities, regardless of their political or social alignment, how do they coalesce around specific ideas and reinforce them among their members, whether consciously or, unconsciously? The document's origin is explicitly rooted in what it calls systematic and empirical observation of behaviors, specifically within leftist circles.
Okay.
The criterion for a behavior's inclusion, as we mentioned, is quite precise. It needed to be observed 3 times, either from a single individual demonstrating it repeatedly or across 3 separate individuals each demonstrating it once.
Right, that 3-instance rule.
Exactly. The source claims this approach allows for a quantitative analysis of social behaviors, arguing that it highlights the collective nature of these traits and their role in solidifying a shared worldview.
And the implications of this approach are quite profound. If you attempt to define group affiliation or even a cultural framework primarily through observable behavioral patterns, it kind of shifts the focus from what people say they believe to what they actually do. This methodology, by its very nature, suggests the focus on outward manifestation. It's about the observable. What does it truly mean for a list to be both an analytical tool and a commentary simultaneously? I mean, an analytical tool typically aims for objective understanding, right? It gives you a framework for dissecting something.
Yeah, ideally.
But a commentary inherently carries an evaluative or critical dimension. It's got a viewpoint. The source isn't merely observing here. It seems to be drawing conclusions about the nature of these dynamics, suggesting an intention to both understand and, well, implicitly critique.
Precisely. The analytical tool aspect suggests a kind of diagnostic checklist for social dynamics, almost like a sociological framework you could apply. But the commentary part undeniably introduces an interpretive, often judgmental layer. It's not simply stating facts. It's situating those facts within a larger narrative about ideological conformity.
Right.
Consider for a moment how such a methodology, this idea of observing repeated behaviors to infer group dynamics, could be applied, or maybe even seen applied, to other social groups or belief systems.
Oh, absolutely.
You could hypothetically observe recurring behaviors within, say, a religious congregation or a corporate culture, or even a highly engaged sports fan base, and try to identify consistent patterns. The challenge, of course, for any observer is maintaining impartiality and avoiding confirmation bias when applying such a framework, especially when the subject matter is politically or culturally charged, like this one. The source, however, is very clear in its assertion that this is a quantitative analysis of social behaviors, designed to reveal the collective nature of these traits, arguing that they are patterns indicative of broader ideological commitments within the specific group it examines. It's an assertion that goes beyond individual quirks to posit a deeply ingrained, shared, and reinforced worldview. It's a big claim.
Okay, this next cluster of traits really makes you stop and think about the nature of truth itself. Seriously. The source identifies several behaviors related to what it perceives as a detachment from reality, almost as if the very ground beneath our feet, the shared understanding of objective fact, is shifting.
And what's particularly striking here is the de-skepticism towards objective truth that the source perceives within these behaviors. It suggests that these beliefs can have dangerous implications, as they encourage individuals to disregard factual information in favor of personal narratives that align with their ideological views. This isn't merely about a difference of opinion or interpretation. The source posits a fundamental difference in what constitutes valid or factual information. It's a very strong claim about the basis of shared understanding.
Okay, let's look at some specifics to unpack this. Trait 1 says, "You believe you are what your imagination says you are." And it continues, "This delusion is characterized by an unwavering conviction in one's self-perception, often leading to a detachment from reality." The source really doubles down here, asserting that this reflects a deeper psychological struggle, where the line between reality and fantasy becomes blurred. It even goes on to suggest this can manifest as a refusal to acknowledge biological truths or societal norms, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, leading to a disconnection from external validation and objective truth. That's a very strong claim about the power of self-perception versus external reality.
It is, and it immediately ties into trait 6. You believe reality isn't real. This delusion, it says, manifests in a rejection of objective truths in favor of subjective experiences, leading to a distorted understanding of the world.
Yeah.
This suggests a complete reframing of what is considered valid or factual, prioritizing internal subjective experience over external empirical evidence. The source views this as a potential gateway to what it calls dangerous implications, because in its view, it can lead people to disregard factual information in favor of personal narratives, effectively undermining shared consensus on facts.
And the implications extend directly to the concept of honesty and factual integrity, right?
Yeah.
Trait 20 bluntly states, "Will lie even with irrefutable evidence." Continues. "Such behavior demonstrates an alarming willingness to distort truth for ideological ends." This is framed not as a mistake or, a misremembering, but as a deliberate act of distortion, or, as the source puts it, a calculated decision, to serve a specific ideological agenda, potentially eroding trust in communication.
Indeed. And the source gets even more specific when it comes to established scientific knowledge. Trait 25 asserts. We'll refer to a biology book as right-wing propaganda. Yeah. Such dismissals reflect an unwillingness to engage with foundational scientific principles when they contradict prevailing ideological narratives. This is a powerful accusation that entire fields of established peer-reviewed knowledge, like biology, can be summarily dismissed or recategorized as partisan propaganda if they don't align with a particular ideological viewpoint.
Which leads us directly to trait 42, which takes us a step further, maybe even escalates it. We'll call science hate speech. It says, labeling scientific inquiry or findings as hate speech represents an alarming trend where factual information is dismissed if it contradicts prevailing narratives or ideologies. This is an intensification of the previous point, isn't it? Where scientific findings aren't just rejected as incorrect, but actively recategorized as something harmful, offensive, or even morally reprehensible, effectively shutting down further discussion or...
Absolutely. If we consider the in-depth implications of a perceived detachment from reality or rejection of objective truths, it raises profound questions about how a group navigates differing interpretations of reality. What happens with the very basis of shared understanding, facts, evidence, commonly accepted ground rules for discussion is called into question or dismissed.
Yeah, where do you even start a conversation then?
Exactly. The societal impact of a fundamental disagreement on what constitutes truth or reality can be severe, leading to deeply fractured discourse, an inability to collectively address pressing problems, and a breakdown of trust in institutions. For example, think about the challenges in addressing public health crises or environmental issues when foundational scientific facts are dismissed or, as the source suggests, recategorized as propaganda or hate speech.
Right.
The source is arguing that this actively undermines the institutions of knowledge, the concept of expertise, and the very processes of discovery and collective problem solving that societies rely on. It highlights what the source views as a critical challenge for any society. How do we find common ground and move forward when fundamental assumptions about truth are in conflict, or when those assumptions are, as the source claims, deliberately distorted? The specific examples, like biology books being labeled right-wing propaganda and scientific inquiry being called hate speech, serve to illustrate what the source considers an alarming trend of ideological capture over empirical truth. It's a stark picture.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, maybe even more complex. This section of the list delves into how identity and perceived oppression play out within these groups. It's a complex and often sensitive area for sure. To make some very specific and quite provocative observations about the dynamics it claims to witness.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source is fundamentally critiquing a system where, in its view, identity politics can lead to heightened sensitivity around personal worth, tied solely to group identity rather than... This raises an important question. How does a strong focus on group identity, particularly one framed by perceived oppression, impact, self-worth, and the pursuit of personal responsibility? The source lays out a series of traits that illustrate this dynamic, often contrasting it with more traditional notions of pride and accomplishment rooted in individual effort.
Let's start with trait 4. You believe victimizing yourself is powerful. It elaborates, this mindset elevates the status of perceived victimhood, creating a hierarchy where those who claim oppression gain social capital and influence. The source states this becomes a tool for manipulation, allowing individuals to deflect accountability and garner sympathy, while simultaneously silencing those who advocate for personal responsibility and resilience. That's a powerful and direct assertion about the perceived strategic use of victimhood.
And it links directly to trait 13, which describes getting triggered because someone doesn't think you're special because you were born into one of the CRT-approved victim groups. They believe deeds and personal responsibility warrant pride. Now, this phrase, CRT-approved victim groups, brings up critical race theory, which, is an academic framework examining how race and racism shape systems.
Right, focusing on systemic issues often.
Exactly. The source's critique here in trait 13 is that individuals might expect special status or validation based on their identity within these frameworks, rather than on personal achievements, character, or deeds. It frames this as a tension between innate group identity and individual merit, implying that the former is prioritized, at least in these observed instances.
That tension, as the source sees it, continues with trait 14. Someone has to explain to you things you can be proud of. So what are you proud of? It continues. The comparison highlights the disparity between traditional accomplishments rooted in hard work and merit versus modern expressions of identity that may lack substantive achievement yet demand validation. This observation implies a significant shift, according to the source, in what is culturally valued as a source of pride, moving from earned achievement to ascribed identity.
Furthermore, trait 17 claims, will insult someone's accomplishments when CRT is all you have. It says, such reactions underscore how critical race theory, as the source perceives it, can be weaponized as a tool for dismissing individual merit in favor of group identity politics, often resulting in divisive rhetoric that undermines constructive discourse. The source views this as a deliberate strategy to devalue individual achievement and character in favor of a group-centric narrative, particularly that individual's identity doesn't fit within the favored victim groups.
Weaponized. That's strong language again. And the scale of perceived oppression is also addressed in trait 2, which states, believes that out of 7 billion people on the planet, white straight males are somehow oppressing everyone else. Quote. Such beliefs, it argues, reflect an oversimplified understanding of systemic issues. It ignores complexities within societal dynamics that cannot be reduced solely to race or gender. This points to a broad generalization and, in the source's view, a simplification of complex power structures and societal challenges.
That perceived simplification, according to the source, often leads to a highly defensive reaction, which it describes in trait 23. Will lose your shit when someone points out that you're not oppressed, you're just stupid. The source commentary is, the defensive reaction underscores an inability or unwillingness to engage critically with one's own beliefs or circumstances when faced with uncomfortable truths or counterarguments. This suggests a fragility when one's self-perception is oppressed or one's adherence to this particular framework is challenged directly.
Okay, and finally, trait 44 illustrates what the source sees as an internal dynamic within these circles. We'll call someone of color or someone married to someone of color a bigot. It suggests such accusations often serve as misguided attempts at virtue signaling rather than fostering genuine understanding or dialogue about race relations. They risk alienating potential allies by reducing complex identities into simplistic labels. This suggests a perceived tendency to use accusations, even against those who might conventionally be seen as allies or members of favored groups, perhaps as a means of establishing one's own perceived moral purity or ideological alignment.
In-depth analysis of the source's argument reveals a consistent and strong theme. Victimhood is portrayed not as a state to be overcome, but as a source of social capital and influence, something that confers status and power.
Like we said, a currency.
Exactly. The tension described between deeds and personal responsibility. The idea that pride comes from individual accomplishment and hard work versus CRT-approved victim groups is central to the source's critique. It suggests a perceived devaluation of individual achievement and moral character in favor of group identity. Consider the potential consequences of what the source calls an oversimplified understanding of systemic issues on complex societal problems.
Right.
If nuanced analysis of historical, economic, or social factors is replaced by broad generalizations about oppression, it could, the source implies, lead to ineffective or even counterproductive solutions, fostering division rather than genuine progress. The source uses these illustrative examples, such as the perceived weaponization of critical race theory, to dismiss individual merit, and the idea that pride must be explained to some to underscore its perspective on these complex and often contentious dynamics of identity and achievement in contemporary society.
Building on that, the list also touches on how responsibility is viewed, or perhaps in the source's estimation, avoided. It delves into who is deemed accountable for what, and the reactions that ensue when accountability is pushed back onto the individual.
What's fascinating here, or perhaps concerning depending on your view, is the source's assertion that this belief system fosters a culture of dependency and entitlement, where individuals refuse to take ownership of their actions and decisions. This raises an important question. What happens to personal growth, problem solving, and societal progress when accountability is consistently deflected or denied? The implications for individual agency and collective development are quite significant according to this document.
So trait 5 jumps right into this theme. You believe self-responsibility is someone else's responsibility. It continues, by shifting the burden of responsibility onto others, it perpetuates a cycle of blame and resentment, undermining personal growth and accountability. This suggests, in the source's view, a systemic issue where individuals avoid owning their actions and instead attribute their circumstances or failures to external forces or other people.
And this ties into how feedback or criticism is received, doesn't it? Trait 12 says, you will call it bias that someone writes down the stupid shit you do after 3 times.
Right, connects back to the methodology.
Exactly. This defensive reaction, the source argues, showcases an unwillingness to confront one's own behavior or its consequences. Instead, it shifts focus onto perceived injustice or the messenger rather than engaging in self-reflection. It suggests that the problem isn't the behavior itself, but the act of documenting or calling attention to it.
We touched on trait 23 earlier in the context of victimhood, but it fits perfectly here as well in the discussion of accountability. We'll lose your shit when someone points out that you're not oppressed, you're just stupid. Again, the source commentary. The defensive reaction underscores an inability or unwillingness to engage critically with one's own beliefs or circumstances when faced with uncomfortable truths. Here, it highlights a profound resistance to any critique that might imply a lack of personal responsibility or perhaps a misperception of one's own situation.
And finally, trait 39 describes a common psychological defense mechanism, as interpreted by the source. Will accuse your opposition of that which you are guilty. It says, this projection is a common psychological defense mechanism where individuals attribute their own undesirable traits or behaviors onto others as a way of deflecting criticism and avoiding accountability for their actions. It's framed as a consistent deflection technique, placing blame elsewhere to avoid self-confrontation.
The in-depth analysis of the source's claims paints a very clear picture of what it calls a cycle of blame and resentment, that it says is perpetuated when self-responsibility is consistently outsourced. This cycle, it argues, actively undermines personal growth because it prevents individuals from learning from their mistakes or adapting their behavior. Seems logical. Back, even observations of repeated actions is dismissed as bias rather than engaged with through genuine self-reflection. It suggests a kind of closed loop where learning and constructive adaptation becomes significantly difficult, if not impossible.
Indeed. If a culture, as described by this source, consistently rejects self-responsibility, it has profound implications for problem-solving or collective action. If problems are always someone else's fault, or if negative outcomes are always attributed to external oppression or systemic failures without any internal accountability, it becomes incredibly difficult to identify actionable steps for improvement or to foster a sense of collective efficacy. The focus shifts entirely from internal agency and what can be changed within to external grievances and what others must do, potentially hindering any constructive engagement with real-world challenges.
Okay, this next section is packed. It's full of what the source sees as profound inconsistencies and hypocrisies. It's where many of the aha moments might come for you, our listener, as we connect disparate observations about belief systems and the actions that supposedly flow from them. The source explicitly highlights what it believes are contradictions that reveal deeper ideological commitments.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, many of these traits highlight what the source views as a selective application of principles, where, as it claims, empirical data is manipulated to fit predetermined narratives. This raises an important question for any group dynamic, really. How do groups reconcile these internal contradictions, especially when they are so explicitly pointed out? Or do they simply exist as unacknowledged discrepancies that are either rationalized away or just ignored?
Let's start with some deeply ethical and life-related observations, where the source makes very direct moral judgments. Trait 7 states, you believe giving a baby a death sentence out of convenience is perfectly fine while believing there's a mythical right somewhere in the Constitution. It continues, this contradiction highlights a profound moral inconsistency. The prioritization of personal convenience over the sanctity of life raises ethical questions about societal values and the implications of such beliefs on future generations. That's a very direct and emotionally charged moral judgment from the source on the issue of abortion rights.
And that moral perspective is further reinforced by trait 8. You will use the euphemism fetus to hide the fact it's a baby. The source argues, by employing language that distances individuals from the reality of pregnancy and childbirth, this tactic serves to dehumanize what many consider an innocent life. The choice of terminology reflects deeper ideological commitments that prioritize certain narratives over biological truths. The source sees this as a deliberate linguistic strategy with profound moral implications designed to shape perception and discussion.
Then there's trait 45, which presents another stark contrast as seen by the source. Consider chemically castrating a pedophile horrible and inhumane, but chemically castrating a child just dandy. Pace. The stark contrast, it asserts, illustrates the moral inconsistencies present within certain ideological frameworks. Advocating for extreme measures against one group while supporting invasive procedures on another raises profound ethical questions about consent and human rights. The source is highlighting a perceived severe double standard on bodily autonomy and medical intervention, particularly as it relates to very vulnerable populations, claiming a fundamental moral contradiction. It's quite a juxtaposition.
In-depth analysis of these traits reveals the source's use of very strong language around profound moral inconsistency and dehumanization through terminology, particularly in the context of life and bodily autonomy. This highlights the crucial role of language in shaping ethical debates, and how different terms can profoundly influence perception, potentially obscuring or emphasizing certain realities to align with deeply held ideological commitments. The document views these linguistic choices as deliberate strategies to advance a particular viewpoint on highly sensitive issues.
Now, let's move into activism, symbolism, and perceived double standards, because this subsection is rich with specific examples from the source, illustrating various forms of what it claims are hypocrisy or selective outrage. Trait 11 states, "You will riot and protest to take a real black woman off a syrup bottle while putting a fake white woman on a beer can." The juxtaposition here, the source says, reflects an ironic twist on social justice activism. It highlights how some movements may prioritize symbolic gestures over substantive change, leading to public backlash and financial repercussions for corporations involved. That's a very specific critique of what the source views as misguided priorities, focusing on superficial changes rather than deeper societal issues.
Indeed. And the theme of selective outrage continues with trait 18. Lost your shit over so long, To Kill a Mockingbird and Huckleberry Finn, but are screaming about banning books with oral sex and masturbation in school libraries, end quote. The source argues, this inconsistency reflects selective outrage, where certain literary works are vilified, while others containing explicit content are defended under the guise of progressive values, end quote. The source frames this as a clear inconsistency in what is considered offensive or inappropriate for educational settings, suggesting apolitical rather than a consistent moral compass behind the book challenges.
Then there's trait 19, which points to an interesting perceived irony in how certain symbols are used. We'll add 666 to your username on social media just to try and shock people. What's hilarious, the source adds, is you're the ones who always bring religion into any discussion about grooming kids. This observation from the source suggests a perceived hypocrisy in how religious symbols are both dismissed or inverted for shock value, while at the same time religion itself is brought into discussions of child protection, implying an inconsistent application of principles.
And trait 21 makes a very grave and highly controversial accusation, stating, being so filled with hate, you will groom, mutilate, and murder your own children while calling your opposition fascists.
Continue.
He continues, this extreme viewpoint highlights profound moral contradictions where actions taken in the name of progressivism can result in harm against vulnerable populations, particularly children, while projecting accusations onto others. This is an incredibly strong and damning claim from the source, alleging direct and extreme harm.
Yeah, that's intense.
It is. And this also links back to trait 15, which makes a similar accusation, stating, we'll call someone a bigot because they don't bow down to the alphabet mafia. Yeah, again, that provocative term, where you're grooming and sterilizing children. These statements are presented by the source as severe moral contradictions, claiming that the ideology as it's manifested leads to direct physical and psychological harm against children, while those who raise concerns are simultaneously labeled with derogatory terms.
Okay. Moving to political rhetoric, trait 24 observes, we'll call Republicans racist while thousands of young black men die in Chicago and New Orleans. The source argues this contradiction highlights how political rhetoric can obscure pressing social issues. It raises questions about accountability among leadership within communities most affected by violence. The source suggests a disconnect between broad, generalized accusations against a political party and specific, localized problems of violence within certain communities, implying that the rhetoric diverts attention from tangible issues.
And the criticism of hypocrisy extends to actions during protest. Trait 31 states, will set fire to someone's business while calling them a fascist. It says, such actions embody a profound hypocrisy. While labeling others as oppressive or authoritarian, these individuals engage in destructive behavior that contradicts their stated values of tolerance and respect for others' rights. This is a direct challenge to the consistency between stated values and actual behavior, accusing those who claim to be fighting oppression of engaging in oppressive acts themselves.
Then there's trait 32, which points to what the source sees as a double standard in arguments about influence. Quote, are the same people who say you can't indoctrinate kids to be gay with a book or a drag show, but continually accuse the church of doing that very thing, unquote. It adds the qualifier, although religion isn't taught in schools and you're not forced to go to church, unquote. This inconsistency, the source claims, highlights a selective application of principles regarding influence and indoctrination, revealing deeper biases and contradictions in their arguments about education and morality. This points to a perceived inconsistency in applying the concept of indoctrination based on whose ideas are being presented.
And the comparison of political violence continues with trait 36. You will scream January 6 while setting fire to someone's business. This statement, the source says, encapsulates the irony of using one political event as justification for violent actions against others, thereby undermining any moral high ground they might claim in their political discourse. The source sees this as an inconsistent application of outrage, criticizing one form of political violence while engaging in another, similar, or equally destructive form.
Finally, trait 41 wraps up this subsection with another observation on reactions to criticism. We'll call someone a racist for telling you not to burn down shit because, as the source provocatively states, the loony left likes to burn shit down. It argues, this accusation often reflects an inability or unwillingness to engage with legitimate concerns about violence and property destruction within political movements, instead resorting to inflammatory language that stifles productive conversation. This implies, from the source's perspective, a deflection of responsibility for destructive acts by immediately resorting to a highly charged accusation like racist.
In-depth analysis of these traits reveals the source's perception of numerous profound juxtapositions and what it calls hypocrisies. There's the critique of symbolic gestures being prioritized over substantive change, exemplified by the Anchim comparison.
Right, that specific example.
We also see the perceived selective outrage over books, where established classics like To Kill a Mockingbird are condemned while sexually explicit content in school libraries is defended. There's the perceived irony of religious symbolism being used alongside critiques of traditional values, and the profound moral contradictions claimed in actions like, as the source alleges, grooming, mutilating, and murdering children, while simultaneously accusing others of fascism.
Those are incredibly serious allegations in the source.
Extremely serious. The specific accusations of grooming and sterilizing children in trait 15 connect strongly to the moral contradictions discussed in traits 19 and 21, asserting a direct harmful consequence of the ideology. The overall critique is that there's a pervasive inconsistency in applying ethical standards, a propensity for destructive actions, and a tendency to label opponents with severe accusations, all while, from the source's view, failing to acknowledge their own internal contradictions.
Shifting now to how science and empirical data are handled, this section of the list highlights what the source perceives as glaring inconsistencies in that realm as well, particularly how facts are selectively engaged with.
What's fascinating here is the source's observation that scientific evidence is selectively embraced or dismissed based on ideological alignment. This raises an important question for any society. What happens to a community's or a society's ability to address complex challenges effectively if factual information is consistently treated as a political football, accepted or rejected based on whether it supports a predetermined narrative?
Yeah, how do you make progress? Trait 9 is quite direct on this point. You will utter the words, follow the science, all while ignoring science itself. Quote, this hypocrisy, the source claims, reveals an inconsistency in how scientific evidence is selectively embraced or dismissed based on ideological alignment. It underscores a broader trend where empirical data is, as the source puts it, manipulated to fit predetermined narratives rather than being used as a foundation for informed decision-making. So the phrase follow the science becomes, in the source's view, a kind of slogan used without a genuine commitment to the scientific method or its findings if they prove inconvenient.
Then there's trait 28, which touches on complex societal issues, specifically the causes of violence. You've been normalizing mental illness for decades, but you believe it's a gun problem, not a mental health problem. This contradiction, it argues, highlights a failure to address the complexities of societal issues. While advocating for mental health awareness is crucial, it is equally important to recognize that attributing violent incidents solely to firearms oversimplifies the underlying psychological factors that contribute to such behaviors. The source argues here for a more nuanced and comprehensive approach to understanding complex problems like gun violence, rather than what it sees as a simplistic, ideologically driven explanation.
And finally, trait 33 points out a perceived tactic to derail scientific discussions. When someone is simply talking science and common sense, you will try to bring religion into it. It offers a hypothetical retort. Well, you know the church. Well, then don't go to church. It's not against the law. Not going to school is. Quote, this reaction, the source claims, illustrates an attempt to divert attention from scientific discourse by invoking religious narratives, which can muddy the waters of rational discussion. It indicates an unwillingness to separate personal beliefs from empirical evidence when those beliefs are challenged by scientific facts. This suggests a perceived maneuver to shift the framework of debate from empirical evidence to religious belief when scientific points are inconvenient.
In-depth analysis of these traits reveals the source views a consistent pattern where scientific evidence is selectively embraced or dismissed, depending on how well it aligns with the prevailing ideology. The claimed oversimplification of complex issues, such as attributing violent incidents primarily to firearms rather than delving into mental health complexities, is a recurring theme.
Right, the gun versus mental health point.
Exactly. The source also highlights what it sees as a tactic to introduce religion to derail discussions rooted in science and common sense. This, according to the document, raises significant challenges for discussing empirical data, especially when that data conflicts with deeply held beliefs or established political narratives. It suggests that, from the source's perspective, narrative consistency might, in these instances, be prioritized over factual accuracy or comprehensive understanding.
Shifting gears a bit now, this part of the list focuses heavily on how communication plays out within these groups, particularly when challenged or confronted with opposing viewpoints. It's about the specific styles of engagement or perhaps disengagement.
What's particularly fascinating here is the pattern the source identifies of dismissing serious discussions by resorting to humor or trivial expressions instead of engaging in rational debate. The source asserts that such behaviors often indicate a lack of substantial counterarguments and a preference for avoiding uncomfortable truths. This raises an important question. How do these specific communication patterns contribute to or detract from meaningful dialogue, mutual understanding, and the ability to bridge divides in a polarized society? The source points to what it views as a fundamental breakdown in rational exchange.
Let's dive into some of these communication traits. Trait 3 suggests, you believe bravery is dangerous. It elaborates. This perspective fosters an environment where courage is equated with recklessness, discouraging individuals from standing up for their beliefs or confronting uncomfortable truths. In a culture that promotes safety over resilience, the very act of being brave can be viewed as an affront to collective sensibilities, leading to a suppression of dissenting voices and a stifling of healthy debate. This implies a kind of chilling effect on open expression and a perceived inversion of traditional values of courage.
Then there's trait 10, which uses a celebrity anecdote to make its point about perceived intellectual laxity. Thanks to Jamie Lee Curtis, who didn't know how many Oscars she'd won, they them can't count. This anecdote, the source explains, serves as a humorous critique of the perceived disconnect between celebrity culture and reality, illustrating how, from the source's perspective, even those in positions of influence may not engage with factual information critically or with intellectual rigor. It's a jab at perceived superficiality, using a specific, maybe slightly odd example.
Yeah, a bit random, but makes a point, I guess. Trait 16 adds to the observation about communication and identity. Never tell anyone anything they're proud of, but will just be triggered that people don't bow down to the alphabet mafia. Again, the phrase alphabet mafia is a provocative and often derogatory term used by critics to refer to the LGBTQ+ community. The source uses this to suggest a perceived imbalance in demanding recognition and deference for one's own group identity, while simultaneously withholding appreciation or respect for others' accomplishments or sources of pride, leading to immediate emotional reactions when challenged.
And language itself becomes a significant flashpoint with trait 26. You'll lose your shit if someone actually uses proper English instead of your made-up pronouns.
Play. This reaction, the source comments, illustrates how language evolves within cultural context, but also highlights tensions between traditional grammar rules and contemporary linguistic adaptations driven by identity politics. It speaks to the intense emotional charge and ideological implications surrounding linguistic choices and personal identity, particularly around gender pronouns. One particularly striking communication observation, according to the source, is trait 27. You will use a stupid emoji or meme, and it specifies the clown face emoji when confronted with common sense and facts. Quote, this behavior, the source argues, exemplifies a tendency to dismiss serious discussions by resorting to humor or trivial expressions instead of engaging in rational debate. Such reactions often indicate a lack of substantial counterarguments and a preference for avoiding uncomfortable truths. This is presented as a visual signal of intellectual disengagement and a deliberate tactic to shut down discussion. Like, I'm not even going to argue, here's a clown face.
Exactly. This perceived avoidance is also seen in trait 29. Run around screaming, that wasn't real socialism. The source claims this phrase reflects an unwillingness to engage with the realities of historical and contemporary socialist practices. It suggests a defensive posture where individuals reject any criticism of socialism by claiming that true socialism has never been implemented, thus sidestepping the practical implications and historical failures of their ideology. It's presented as a perceived rhetorical escape hatch to avoid accountability for the outcomes of a particular political system.
And trait 30 describes what the source views as a conversational dead end. When you can't counter my copy and paste, you'll just use the words copy and paste over and over. This tactic, it suggests, illustrates a reliance on repetitive phrases rather than substantive dialogue. It reveals an inability to critically analyze opposing viewpoints and instead resorts to dismissive language that undermines meaningful discourse, end quote. This suggests a perceived reliance on pre-programmed scripts or talking points rather than genuine, spontaneous intellectual engagement, like hitting a conversational wall.
The source also points to perceived rationalizations with trait 34. Will use unrelated behavior to justify their sick, grooming behavior. It argues, this defense mechanism serves as a means of rationalizing actions that many view as unethical or harmful. By shifting focus onto unrelated issues, they seek to deflect criticism rather than confront the moral implications of their actions directly. This suggests a tactic of misdirection and moral equivocation when faced with accusations of behavior that is widely considered inappropriate.
Then there's the perceived irony of trait 35. We'll call someone triggered while insulting them because you're triggered. It even includes the definition. Triggered, caused to feel an intense and usually negative emotional reaction. This paradoxical behavior, the source claims, demonstrates a lack of self-awareness. While accusing others of being overly sensitive, they reveal their own emotional volatility through insults and personal attacks. It's presented as a perceived projection of one's own emotional state onto others, highlighting a hypocrisy in emotional accusations. No, you're triggered.
Right. And insults are further addressed in trait 37. You resort to insults as you can't handle the truth. It adds the definition of delusional. Delusional, characterized by or holding false beliefs. Insults, the source argues, often serve as a defense mechanism for those unable or unwilling to confront uncomfortable realities, reflecting deeper psychological issues rather than robust argumentation. The source argues that insults are a sign of intellectual weakness, a substitute for genuine argument when faced with perceived inconvenient truths.
Trait 38 points to a perceived self-reinforcing cycle of behavior. We'll lose your shit when someone calls you woke, and to prove you're not, you do the things on this list over and over and over. This defensive reaction, it suggests, often highlights an insecurity about one's beliefs. Rather than engaging in constructive dialogue about what woke truly means, individuals may resort to behaviors that reinforce the very stereotype they aim to reject. It's presented as a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy, where the attempt to deny the label ironically leads to its reinforcement through observable actions.
And finally, a visual observation regarding online presentation in trait 40. You think wearing a mask to hide their face in your profile picture doesn't make you look stupid at all. This choice, the source posits, can be seen as emblematic of broader cultural trends, where personal identity is obscured for various reasons, often under the guise of anonymity or protection, yet can paradoxically lead others to question the sincerity behind such choices. It's an observation about the perceived implications of anonymity and obscured identity in online spaces.
And a meta-commentary on communication is found in trait 43. It will not occur to you that if people can simply copy and paste their counter-arguments, you might be programmed. Like in a cult. No. This observation, the source states, raises important questions about critical thinking and intellectual independence. When individuals rely on rote responses without understanding underlying concepts, it suggests an adherence more akin to dogma than genuine belief. This directly links back to the cult framing in the title, implying a lack of original thought or genuine internal conviction behind the repeated phrases.
In-depth analysis of these communication traits paints a picture where, from the source's perspective, bravery is perceived as suppressed, leading to a stifling of dissent and a lack of willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Linguistic adaptations, such as the use of specific pronouns, are viewed critically as sources of tension with traditional norms, often leading to highly emotional reactions.
Yeah, that came through strongly.
The frequent use of emojis or memes is described as a deliberate tactic to dismiss serious discussions, rather than engaging with facts or logical arguments. The not real socialism defense is framed as an unwillingness to confront historical or practical realities, serving as a rhetorical evasion. The source repeatedly asserts the presence of psychological defense mechanisms like projection, as seen in trait 39, where individuals accuse others of their own guilt and resorting to insults when, unable or unwilling to confront uncomfortable realities, indicating a lack of robust argumentation.
Right. The insults as a defense mechanism idea.
Exactly. The Jamie Lee Curtis anecdote serves as a humorous but pointed critique of perceived intellectual superficiality, while the copy and paste argument and the suggestion of being programmed directly challenge the idea of critical thinking and intellectual independence. These communication patterns, the source argues, indicate a significant challenge to meaningful, open dialogue and genuine intellectual engagement.
Okay, our final cluster of traits really digs into specific political reactions and perceived blind spots, revealing what the source sees as key ideological commitments within this group, particularly concerning loyalty and how different issues are prioritized.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the source suggests these behaviors reveal an unwavering loyalty that can blind individuals from critically evaluating political figures and illustrate how deeply entrenched political identities can overshadow broader discussions. This raises an important question. How do strong political affiliations influence the perception and discussion of facts, potentially leading to a dismissal of contradictory evidence, and what impact does that have on societal discourse?
Let's look at trait 46. You believe Joe Biden is a good president and isn't corrupt at all, the source commentary is. Holding this belief often requires ignoring substantial evidence that contradicts this view. It reflects an unwavering loyalty that can blind individuals from critically evaluating political figures based on their actions rather than party affiliation. This is a direct challenge to a specific political stance, implying, from the source's viewpoint, a lack of critical assessment or maybe a selective perception of facts driven by partisan loyalty.
And then there's trait 47, which highlights a specific conversational pattern. When any other topic on this list other than politics is mentioned, you bring up Trump, quote. This tendency, the source argues, reveals an inability or unwillingness to engage with issues outside of partisan politics. It underscores how deeply entrenched political identities can overshadow broader discussions about societal challenges. The source sees this as a Trump trigger, a perceived immediate deflection mechanism that derails conversations and prevents engagement with issues on their own merits, always bringing it back to one polarizing figure.
Interesting observation. Finally, trait 48 observes a strong reaction to a national symbol. If the sight of the American flag triggers you but you refuse to leave, unquote. This reaction, the source suggests, symbolizes complex feelings toward national identity. While some may see the flag as emblematic of freedom and unity, others may associate it with oppression or exclusion, yet choosing not to disengage from such symbols suggests unresolved tensions within one's relationship with national identity. This trait highlights a profound internal conflict around national identity, where a powerful symbol evokes a strong negative emotional response, yet there's no withdrawal from the context, implying an internal struggle or perhaps a desire to fundamentally change what the symbol represents.
In-depth analysis of these traits reveals the source's portrayal of political loyalty, potentially leading to ignoring substantial evidence, as seen in its critique of holding certain political beliefs despite perceived contradictory information. The Trump trigger is presented as a prime example of how political identity can overshadow engagement with any other topic, making it difficult to discuss broader societal issues without immediately reverting to partisan discourse.
Right, everything becomes about that one thing.
Exactly. This, according to the source, raises serious questions about the nature of political discourse, when certain such strong emotional responses, potentially closing down rational discussion and defensive reaction.
How groups reinforce specific narratives, and the potential for perceived contradictions and selective applications of principles, especially when faced with what the source describes as a blurring of lines between objective truth and subjective experience. It really highlights the importance of critical thinking, doesn't it, in a world overflowing with information and incredibly strong opinions.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? This document, while offering a particular and at times highly provocative viewpoint, prompts us to reflect on the dynamics within any group or movement, not just the one examined here. It encourages us to look at how information is processed, how arguments are constructed or may be avoided, and how individuals engage with differing perspectives. The emphasis on observable behaviors gives us a framework, at least from the source's perspective, to analyze patterns of thought and action that might otherwise go unnoticed.
And here's a final thought for you after this. If observable behaviors can be systematically documented, as this source attempts, to highlight ideological conformity in one context, how might that same analytical approach be applied to any group or belief system, including those we ourselves belong to or admire? What behaviors might surface if we turn the same critical lens inwards? or towards movements we typically support, using a similar methodology of observation. It's a thought that really encourages self-reflection, I think, on the patterns we exhibit and maybe even perpetuate in our own communities. Something to consider.